Russia had the third largest empire ever, but they had very little in the way of overseas territory. Instead, they focused on just expanding into neighbouring states, and in the 19th century, of course, they expanded into Central Asia. Now, one person I think you should know about is Nikolai Przhevalsky. He is a Joseph Stalin lookalike and an imperialist. He explored Central Asia and Western China around the 1870s and 1880s and advocated Russia expand into there, but he wasn't a great fan of the Asians. After all, he called the Asians the dregs of the human civilization and called the Tajik ruler Yakub Beg the same feckless shit as all the other Asiatics. But he did claim that a few hundred Russian soldiers could claim everywhere in between Lake Baikal and Tibet. But towards the end of the 19th century, many high-ranking people began calling for the annexation of Tibet, Mongolia and places like that. Now, I won't go into too much detail about their beliefs here, but you should look up the myth of the White Tsar. In short, the Russian aristocracy believed that Buddhists thought that they were the reincarnation of a Buddhist deity named Tara, and they wanted to unite Asia against Europe. Now, the high-ranking people who thought this was like the likes of Nicholas II and Prince Utomsky, probably said that badly, but they planned on using the large Buddhist population already in Russia to sort of foment alliances with Mongolia, Tibet, and places like that. And they were somewhat successful. After all, they did form an alliance with an advisor to the Dalai Lama, but of course they didn't go any further than that. However, the Russians did try to create an overseas empire, most notably in the Americas, well, Western America in particular. And I'll assume that a lot of you already know that Russia controlled Alaska in the 18th and 19th century, but I'll assume less of you know that they in fact set up colonies as far south as California. Places like Fort Ross was set up by the Russians, and much like the Dutch East India Company, the Russians set up the Russian-American Trade Company to sort of manage these colonies. Now, of course, the Spanish were the dominant force in the area at the time, in the beginning of the 19th century, but a Russian officer named Zavaloshin, he was pressing the Russian government to annex the entire west coast, or at the very least encourage Californians to rise up, break away from the Spanish, and form an alliance with the Russians. Of course, nothing came of these plans though. However, in the 1840s, when the Americans took control of the region, they all but chased the Russians away. And by this point, the colonies had become less profitable because of overhunting. And they feared antagonizing the British and Americans by keeping a hold of Alaska and places like that, and their navy was in no position to defend them, so they eventually sold Alaska to the Americas in the 1860s. This weak navy of theirs prevented the Russians from joining in the scramble for Africa, but they did try to. They more or less formed an alliance with the Ethiopians and began supplying them arms in the 1880s, arms that would be very effective against the Italians during the Italian-Ethiopian War. And with the help of the Ethiopians, the Russians tried to start a colony in a town called Sigalo in Djibouti. However, the 100 or so Cossacks who were sent to East Africa began raiding neighbouring towns, which angered the Ethiopians, and the French were already sort of establishing themselves in the region, and the Russians feared another war against the French which they could not win, so they destroyed the colony and the region was eventually annexed by France.